Hello, please ignore any weird audio issues. I haven't set up my audio on this very well yet, but um, the idea is if you wanted to use, or for making an add-on in Blender, you might want to make it a little bit faster than what you would if you were to just use Python. And Cython is very useful for that because it can do some compiling for Blender, or not Blender, for Python, where it allows it to redirect to a C++ compiled code, which can give you significant speed boosts. I average from like 2 to sometimes over 100 times faster. There's a good website for getting to start with, which is the documentation for Cython. But the main idea is that to set it up, you'll need Python installed. So make sure you have a version of Python installed on your machine, regardless of whether you're on Linux, Windows, or Mac. I know you can use Cython on Linux and Windows. I've tested it on both. I do not have a Mac, cannot test that, so I can't really help you there, but I believe it does work on there. You can get a version of Python from their website. If you're on a Linux distro, normally you can get them from the repositories. On Windows, you can get a version of it from the Microsoft Store, but it might not be the version you need, because you do have to be careful on which Python version you're using, because it has to be the same Python version as the version you are intending to actually run with. So for Blender, the current version of Python it uses is 3.10. However, I can't use that because the Python version on my machine is 3.11. So the version of Blender I'm going to be using is the 4.1 beta release. You can install Cython using pip, and then once you have that installed, you should be able to compile, which I will show an example of in a second. If you're on Windows, for me, I had to use commands like this in order to be able to actually call Python, because I had to install a specific version from the Python website, and then I had to use this command to call pip. On Linux, which is what I'm more used to, I ended up using these to install. Though to install Cython, it'd be something like this. But when you go to compile, which for me I had to do in a virtual environment because I'm on Ubuntu, but you can do this without it. I recommend making a folder, going into it, and having your things in there. So for me, what you'll need is whatever Python file you want to compile. So in this case, I've got one right here called primes, which I made following this example on this. All this does is it imports Cython, makes a function that simply tries to grab the number of primes that you put in there up to 1,000. And what you can do in this case is it's written using some Cython based syntax to make it so it compiles better. From what I know, you do not have to do this, but it's recommended if you want better performance. Once you have this done, you'll rename it to pyx is the what's recommended. You don't have to do that, but it's recommended to indicate that this is intended to be run like Cython. This code will still run in Python though if you left it as py. So what you will do then is inside here, I'm going to go ahead and delete this so I can try it. You can run your setup file, which will look something like this. Again, I got this from following this tutorial, if you wanted to go back to look at that. So all this does is it grabs the required tools to run the compilation script using Python, which will then use the compiler that your computer has for C. If you're on Windows, you might end up needing to install that. And what this will do is you'll want to change the name of this to whatever it is. One of the alternatives is if you wanted to do this without running the command, because you will need to run a command, which for me, the command will look like this. I'm in a Python environment, so I gotta remember that. Mine will look like this, gotta remove that. drag this out. It'll look like this, where these are arguments. You can avoid needing to put these arguments if you actually put them as script arguments, which is one I set up as an alternative. Just something to note if you need to try to do something like that. Let me make sure I wrote this correctly by running it. Yeah, for me, it went ahead, build it, and then copied it over. If you're on something like Windows, you might sometimes run into the issue of it won't finish copying it, and it will give you like an error saying the directory that you're in does not exist. I ran into that error. However, it does still build it. So, because you're going to get a bunch of weird little files that end up being made. For me, it makes this C1, this file right here, if it actually copies it into the directory you're in, because I'm in my bin one. But also, inside this build one, you'll end up with these files. If it did not copy it over inside this library one, you'll have this file. Now, the ending will be different if you're on Windows, and probably different again if you're on Mac, but this is what it gave me because I'm on Linux. So I'm going to jump back, because that's the file you want, which I have a copy of it here since it finished it. This is the file you'll be importing. So now, with this file, what you'll want to do is copy it over and have something that runs in. So for me, what I did is I made like a test file for it, but I'm going to go and show how I set it up in Blender. So for me, I made a new folder, called it test add-on. You can name it whatever. It's not necessarily important. And inside of it, I put that. And then I have the Python script that will be running. In Blender, to get it to properly load other files, if you have more than one file in an add-on, you will need one that is called __init__.py. This is the file that Blender will read from when you import it as an add-on. So for me, I have made my init file, is another way of saying it. I have these basic Blender add-on stuff, which if you wanted to, there's documentation on Blender for making an add-on if you want to go and look at that, but this is something for Blender to read for the add-on. And ignore this. This was me attempting to use an alternative thing. So to properly get it to import this, when you're in Blender, you'll want to tell it to import from the local directory, else it's going to have trouble finding it. So, because this is in the local directory, because they're in the same file. So you'll want to use a dot. So here, your options for importing it, since in my case it made something called primes, because that's what I called the original file, was primes.pyx. So it made a primes file. I can do from .primes, import primes, and this imports specifically the primes function. Or instead, you could import the whole thing like you would normally do if you just wrote import primes, but to tell it to do it from the local space, you can do from dot, which I have this one commented out since I've been calling the original one. I have times also imported solely because I was doing time testing, but in short, you can then use the register and unregister as you would when making a Blender add-on. For me, I can then call it and it will run it. Now, with that noted, you'll probably want to actually turn this into an add-on. So what you would then do is take something like this and you would then compress it to a zip file. So I'll just give it another name because I have multiple I made for testing, called test add-on 4. With this made, what you can then do is load this into Blender. So let me go ahead and load up Blender. Give me just a second. Probably gonna have to skip this part as I have to remember how to pull up Blender in my, oh yeah, okay. Get back to here. So for me, I opened up my folder for the beta release, because if you're on Windows, you can use the Windows tab in Blender to pull down the terminal. On Linux, I have to do it this way. So what I can do is inside of this, I can call Blender. And what you can do here is go to Edit and then Preferences. And then here you can then go to add-ons and you can install whatever add-on you just made. So I'm going to go to install. Now on here, I'm going to go to the Blender file because that's where I had it. And then I've got the add-on. So what you can do is then install add-on. What it will then do is it'll go through and install it, and it should make it appear by adding a filter to make it appear. If it installs it but doesn't do this, sometimes I have to like click on it, wiggle this window around for it to update. Other times I have to add the filter manually. But then you will have the add-on. So for me, all my add-on does is calls the prime function 1,000 times in a print statement, tells me how long it ran, and then when I unregister it, it says goodbye. So I'm going to leave the terminal there. I'm going to hit this check mark to install the add-on. As you can see, it then ran it 1,000 times, giving me 1,000 different primes, and then it told me how long it took to run. In my case, it took 0.004 seconds, or 0.004 seconds. And then to uninstall it, you can uncheck this. Now, if you want it to remain, you'd have to change, I think, your defaults to leave this one installed, because normally I think these are temporary. And if you want to remove this from the wherever Blender installed it, you can then hit this and hit OK, and it will uninstall it completely. Oh yeah, something I wanted to note, because it's one of the other errors when I ran trying to do this on Windows, and also in other places. If you have Python, like if you get an error when trying to compile your Cython, like what I was doing earlier, using this command, which you needed that setup file to do, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned that, but I ran into an error where it said python.h was missing. I also ran into this if you try to do the compiling in Blender. That means that the version of Python you are using does not have the DevTools, which means it's a smaller version of Python, likely done to save space. It will not be able to do the compiling for Cython, even if you somehow got Cython installed to it. So I believe there are ways of adding those DevTools to it, but I'm not very fluent on how to do that. You'd have to figure that out yourself. But from what I found online, due to the difficulty of just finding information on it, most people just recommend trying to reinstall Python with those tools. But that's what that error means if you somehow got that. And for the most part, that should cover everything that you would need to make the basics. I guess just keep in mind the version of Python that you're going to be running it on. For me, again, I can check that in Blender by going to the scripting tab, and it will tell you the version of Python here, 3.11, which is why the version of Python I am running on my computer is also 3.11. Let me open up my other terminal, which you can check that by running the version of Python and then doing /version. Or if you're on Windows, I think you would do py and then /version. Though you should know what version you have if you manually installed it. But with that should be everything that you would need to know. Have a good day, and good luck building your add-on.